The 11-year-old who stood up against racism. What happened next will shock you. Welcome to our channel. We're so glad you're here because today we have an unforgettable story that will touch your heart. It's a powerful journey of courage, identity, and standing up for what you believe in, no matter the odds. Ethan Walker, a young boy of just 11 years old, shares something deeply personal in front of his class. He proudly declares that his father is Jason Statham, the famous action star. But instead of support, Ethan is met with mockery and disbelief, not just from his classmates, but from his teacher as well. In the face of ridicule, Ethan stands his ground, but the twist comes when his famous father steps into the classroom to set the record straight. His quiet, yet powerful words shake the entire room and change everything. This is a story of truth, injustice, and the power of never backing down. We want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a situation where your truth was doubted or dismissed? How did you handle it? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share the next chapter of our journey with you. Stay tuned for more. 11-year-old Ethan Walker stood in front of his classroom, heart pounding with excitement as he prepared to share something deeply personal. He had always been proud of his father, Jason Statham, a famous action movie star known for his tough guy roles in films like The Transporter and The Expendables. As he gazed out at his classmates, a quiet confidence filled him. He knew that what he was about to say would be different from anyone else's story. This wasn't just about a hero from his family. This was about his real hero, the man he looked up to every single day, his dad. "I'm Ethan Walker," he began, his voice steady. "And my hero is my dad, Jason Statham. He's an actor, and he's my hero because he taught me to never give up, to stand strong, and to believe in myself." He felt his chest swell with pride as he spoke the truth. His classmates, however, did not share his enthusiasm. Mrs. Parker, his teacher, looked up from her desk and raised an eyebrow. Her expression was unreadable, but the coolness in her eyes was hard to miss. She didn't encourage Ethan like she had with other students. Instead, she dismissed his words almost immediately. "Ethan," she said, her tone sharp and disbelieving, "let's not make up stories. You're supposed to tell us about someone real, not someone you've seen on TV." The words stung, but Ethan pushed through. "But he is real. He's my father," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The class fell silent for a moment, but then the laughter started. It began with a few snickers from the back of the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of mockery. Ethan's classmates couldn't contain their amusement. They didn't believe him, not because of the story, but because of the way he looked. His skin color didn't match the image they had in their minds of someone like Jason Statham. Ethan could see their faces twist with disbelief, their eyes filled with judgment. Mrs. Parker, too, looked at Ethan with doubt. "This isn't the time for fantasy," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. "You need to tell us about someone who's actually in your life, not someone who's famous and far away." Ethan felt the weight of her words crash down on him. He had thought she would be the one to support him, to listen to his story with an open mind, but instead she had belittled him, turning his truth into a joke. As the class continued to laugh and jeer, Ethan stood there, frozen, his heart sinking. The laughter rang in his ears, each mocking laugh like a sharp jab to his self-esteem. He clutched the piece of paper in his hand, his speech now feeling worthless. How could they not believe him? How could Mrs. Parker, the adult, dismiss the truth he had shared so proudly? Was it because his father didn't fit their idea of who should be considered a hero? Was it because his skin color made his truth seem impossible? It was a painful realization for Ethan, one that no child should have to face at such a young age. It wasn't just the kids in his class who laughed at him, it was the teacher too, the very person entrusted with nurturing young minds. Her dismissal was the worst part, the adult in the room, someone who should have known better, treating him like a liar. The incident didn't just expose Ethan to mockery, it revealed something deeper, something uncomfortable that many people, especially children, were unwilling to acknowledge. It revealed how prejudice, even the quiet kind, could seep into everyday situations, coloring perceptions of truth and identity. It wasn't just a matter of disbelief. It was a matter of assumptions based on appearance, a judgment of what was real and what was not based on skin color and societal expectations. Ethan's story was dismissed not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't fit the narrow mold others had created for him. And that, in itself, was a form of injustice. His truth had been rejected because of prejudice, something so deeply ingrained in society that even a teacher, someone who should be fostering acceptance, had been blind to it. This moment was more than just an embarrassing incident. It set the stage for a much deeper exploration of prejudice and injustice. It forced Ethan to confront the painful reality that sometimes, even when you speak the truth, it isn't always enough. The world doesn't always listen. But what Ethan didn't know yet was that this experience, this moment of ridicule, would ultimately be the very thing that would empower him to rise above the prejudice he faced. Ethan didn't speak much about the incident when he got home. His mom, Rebecca, had seen the usual look on his face, the one that meant he was holding something in, something heavy, but she didn't ask right away. She knew him well enough to give him space. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table eating his dinner, the silence between them was thick, but neither of them knew exactly how to break it. Ethan kept his head down, poking at his food, trying not to think about what happened at school. Rebecca was quietly chopping vegetables, her eyes occasionally flicking toward him, wondering if he would open up. But Ethan remained quiet, lost in his thoughts. He could still hear the laughter from Mrs. Parker's class, feel the sting of every mocking glance from his classmates. It had been bad enough that they didn't believe him, but the real pain came from the way they had laughed at him, the way his truth had been turned into a joke. He had wanted to tell his mom what happened, to make her understand why his chest felt so tight, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stared down at his plate, feeling smaller and smaller with every passing second. Finally, after a long pause, Rebecca spoke. "How was school today, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft, but there was a firmness there, a quiet strength that told Ethan his mother wasn't going to let this slide. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the turmoil he was holding back, but instead of pushing him, she simply waited. Ethan looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time that evening. "It was fine," he said, though his voice was hollow, empty of the usual enthusiasm he had when talking about school. He knew his mom didn't buy it, but he wasn't ready to tell her the truth. Not yet. Rebecca didn't push. She just nodded, the understanding between them clear. She had been there herself, dealing with prejudice, trying to navigate a world that often refused to see her for who she truly was. She had grown up knowing the sting of judgment, the feeling of being overlooked or dismissed because of the color of her skin. She had always told Ethan that the world might not be fair, but it was important to stand tall and proud in the face of it. Later that night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the thoughts started flooding in. Why had they laughed at him? Why had Mrs. Parker been so quick to dismiss him? His dad was Jason Statham, for crying out loud. He wasn't making it up. But the kids in his class didn't care. They saw a black boy in front of them, and to them, that meant he couldn't possibly have the life he was talking about. It wasn't their fault. Not entirely, he told himself. He knew the world was full of people who judged others based on the outside, based on things that didn't matter. But somehow that knowledge didn't make the pain any easier to bear. The next day at school, the tension was palpable. The moment Ethan stepped onto the bus, he could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that followed him wherever he went. It was like everyone knew what had happened the day before, and now they were all waiting for the next chapter of the joke to unfold. Ethan felt like he was walking around in a glass box, everyone watching, but no one really seeing him for who he was. At school, he was met with a cold indifference. It wasn't as if anyone outright mocked him to his face again. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, it was the silence that stung. The kids didn't laugh, but they didn't make room for him either. They avoided his eyes, kept their conversations just out of his reach, and let him drift through the hallways like a ghost. Even Mrs. Parker barely acknowledged him. She handed out assignments with her usual cold professionalism, never once meeting his eyes. But Ethan wasn't invisible. Not entirely. Not when he had his dad's words echoing in his mind, telling him to be strong, to stand up for what was true. He might have been treated like a joke in Mrs. Parker's classroom, but he wasn't going to let that define him. He wasn't going to let the world's disbelief make him shrink down into someone he wasn't. That afternoon, as he walked home, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He could keep his head down, let the ridicule pass, and let the world forget. Or he could do something more, something that would prove once and for all that his truth mattered. He didn't know how, but he knew this. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let his story be dismissed forever. This wasn't just about a father's legacy. This was about who he was and who he knew he could be. And somehow, he would find a way to make them see it. The days that followed felt like a blur to Ethan. The weight of the previous day's events hung over him like a dark cloud, and no matter how hard he tried to focus on something else, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, judged, and dismissed. At school, it wasn't just the whispers or the sideways glances, it was the silence. His classmates didn't need to laugh anymore. The absence of acknowledgement was enough to make him feel invisible, like he didn't even matter enough to mock. And then there was Mrs. Parker. She had barely spoken to him after the presentation, and every time she passed him in the halls or looked at him from the front of the classroom, her eyes seemed colder. He was just another student to her, nothing special, nothing worth paying attention to. Her dismissive attitude stung more than the laughter had. It wasn't just the students who rejected him. It was the teacher, the one adult who should have known better. But in the depths of his hurt, something started to stir in Ethan. The pain he'd felt from being humiliated began to shift into something else, something like resolve. He was done being invisible. He didn't want to keep hiding, to shrink away because of the weight of their doubts and sneers. wasn't going to let this slide, not anymore. The moment came sooner than he expected. On that Thursday afternoon, as the clock ticked toward the end of the school day, Mrs. Parker stood in front of the class, announcing the details for the following week's Career Hero Day. Her voice was sharp and disinterested, as if the whole thing was just another task to check off her list. Each of you will give a short presentation about someone in your family who inspires you, she said, barely glancing at the class. Your hero should be someone who has a real job, someone who has actually made an impact on your life. Ethan's heart began to race. He had thought about this moment for days, weighed his options, and come to a decision. His father's story needed to be told. The world needed to know who he was, who Ethan was. He didn't care if no one believed him anymore. He wasn't going to back down. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the old shoebox full of keepsakes. He found the photograph he had tucked away, the one he had been so careful not to show anyone. It was a picture of a younger Jason Statham, his father, holding a tiny swaddled baby in his arms, a protective hand resting on the child's back. The smile on Jason's face wasn't for the camera, it was for his son, Ethan. It was the kind of smile that had always been there, through every phone call, every letter, every visit. Ethan's mother, Rebecca, quietly watched him from the kitchen doorway. She knew what this moment meant for him. She had always told him that the world might not always be kind, but he had to stand tall in his truth. Tell the truth, Ethan, she had told him earlier, but be ready for them to not believe it. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he had no other choice. The next day, during recess, Ethan stayed behind in the classroom, going over his notes one last time. His classmates played outside, but he focused on the words he had written. Words about his father, about Jason Statham, the man who had shaped his world. He was about to show them all. But just as Ethan was finishing up, Colin and two of his friends walked past him, laughing loudly. "Who are you going to say your dad is, Ethan?" Colin taunted. "LeBron? Obama?" He laughed at his own joke, but Ethan remained calm, steady, his eyes locked on Colin. "Vin Diesel," he said, his voice quiet but firm. For a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter. "Vin Diesel, you're joking, right?" Colin's voice was laced with mockery, and the other boys chimed in. "Yeah, right, you and Vin Diesel? Look at you, he's white." One of them laughed harder. "Maybe your mom wishes he was your dad." Ethan's face burned with embarrassment, but he didn't flinch. He didn't react. Instead, he pulled the photo from his folder, staring at it for a moment, trying to remind himself of the truth he carried in his heart. This was real. He wasn't lying. The next morning, Ethan stood before the class, his nerves simmering beneath the surface. He had practiced this speech so many times, but now that he was actually here, in front of everyone, his hands trembled slightly. His classmates were already whispering, clearly anticipating the joke to come. He set the photo of his father on Mrs. Parker's desk, as if this would somehow prove to them what he had been trying to say all along. "My name is Ethan Walker," he began, his voice a little shaky but steadying with each word. "My hero is my dad, Mark Sinclair. But you probably know him as Vin Diesel." Immediately the laughter erupted. Colin slapped his desk, his laughter loud and mocking. "Vin Diesel, bro. You're kidding, right? Do you even look in the mirror? Ethan felt his throat tighten, but he pushed through. He's my dad. I'm telling you the truth, he said, his voice stronger now. But Mrs. Parker cut him off, her face hardening. Ethan, let's not turn this into a fantasy exercise, she said dismissively. Career Hero Day is about real people, not celebrities. Let's get back on track. Ethan's stomach dropped. His truth, his identity, had been rejected again. This time, not by his classmates, but by the one person he thought would stand up for him. His teacher. He sat back down, his heart racing, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The humiliation wasn't just in the laughter, it was in the way she refused to believe him. The damage was done. Ethan's truth had been laughed at and ridiculed. But little did he know the story was far from over. It was about to take a turn that no one, not even Mrs. Parker, could have anticipated. The room was thick with tension as Ethan walked back to his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the photo of his father. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, their gazes heavy with mockery and disbelief. Mrs. Parker hadn't even looked at him. Instead, she returned to her desk, busily scribbling on papers, as though nothing had happened, as though his truth hadn't been shattered right in front of her. But as Ethan sat down, the laughter didn't die down like he thought it would. It lingered, like an echo bouncing off the walls, lingering in the air between each snicker and whisper. Ethan's heart raced, and he could feel the sting of humiliation prickling at his skin. His face burned hot with embarrassment. Was this it? Was this how his story would end? With laughter and dismissal? He didn't know how long he sat there, hands clenched, staring at the desk, trying to block out the noise around him. But it wasn't just the kids in the room anymore. It was the weight of Mrs. Parker's words that he couldn't shake. The truth didn't matter. His truth didn't matter. To her, to his classmates, it was just another fantasy, just another lie that didn't fit their narrow idea of what reality was supposed to be. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. The usual chatter, the usual rush to gather their things, didn't come. Everyone seemed frozen in place, waiting for something. Ethan was the first to stand, his legs stiff, his heart still pounding in his chest. He could feel the sting of Mrs. Parker's cold dismissal still sharp in his mind, but there was something else stirring too, something deeper. He wanted to run away, to hide in the library, to escape the whispers and the ridicule. But then something unexpected happened. The door to the classroom creaked open, and in walked a figure that made the entire class freeze. Ethan looked up, blinking in disbelief, his breath catching in his throat. It was him. The man from the photo. The one who, until now, had been nothing but a figure on a screen, a distant dream. Jason Statham. The room fell into complete silence, the kind of silence that feels like a vacuum, sucking all the sound out of the air. Jason walked in like he owned the place, his presence commanding every inch of space. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the stunned faces of the students, the wide-eyed disbelief. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be real. This was his dad, standing there in front of everyone, in his world. Jason didn't say anything right away. He simply looked around the room, his gaze falling on Ethan. There was no hesitation in his steps as he walked to the front of the class where Mrs. Parker stood, visibly flustered. "Mrs. Parker," Jason said, his voice calm but strong, "I believe there's been some confusion." His eyes met Ethan's for a brief moment, and the warmth in them sent a wave of relief through Ethan's chest. He wasn't alone. Mrs. Parker, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words, stood frozen in place. Jason turned his attention back to the class, addressing them with a quiet authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "You all laughed at my son, didn't you?" Jason's voice rang out, clear and steady. "You laughed because you couldn't imagine a kid like Ethan having a dad like me. You mocked him for telling his truth." He let his words sink in, the weight of them pressing down on every student in the room. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked at Jason, unable to speak. He had never felt so proud, so seen. Jason continued, his gaze never leaving the class. "I'm Jason Statham. This young man," he pointed to Ethan, "is my son. Not because he looks like me, not because I'm famous, but because he's mine. And his truth doesn't need your permission to be real. The color of his skin doesn't make his story any less true." The room was completely still. Not a single student dared to move, their faces painted with shock and recognition. Even Mrs. Parker, who had stood so confidently before, seemed small now, shrinking under the weight of Jason's words. "You all judged my son based on the color of his skin," Jason said, his voice now tinged with a quiet fury. "But let me tell you something. You'll never truly know a person until you listen to them, until you believe their truth, no matter what they look like." Ethan felt a shift inside him, something he hadn't felt since the laughter first erupted in Mrs. Parker's class. It wasn't just pride. It was a sense of vindication, of justice finally being served. His truth had been mocked, ridiculed, but here, in front of the class, in front of Mrs. Parker, it was being recognized for what it was, a simple, undeniable truth. Jason turned back to Ethan, his expression softening. "You didn't lie, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You told the truth, and you should never, ever be ashamed of it." Ethan felt the tears welling up, but he held them back. He didn't need to cry, not now, not when the truth had finally been heard. Jason gave him a small nod and a reassuring smile before he turned to Mrs. Parker one last time. "I hope you learned something today," he said quietly. "This young man deserves respect, and it's time you started giving it to him." The silence that followed was profound, almost suffocating. Mrs. Parker didn't speak. She didn't even look up. She simply stood there, her head lowered in shame. And in that silence, something changed. Ethan had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had made them all see the truth. The silence in the classroom felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of Jason's words. Ethan sat still, his heart still racing, but there was a new sense of peace settling in him. His truth had finally been acknowledged, not by the students who had laughed at him, not even by Mrs. Parker, but by the one person whose validation meant everything, his father. Jason had spoken the truth with such quiet authority, such unwavering certainty, that Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. His dad had stood up for him in the way only a father could, in the way that made everything else in the room feel small and insignificant. The moment lingered in the air, thick with the unspoken realization that what had just transpired wasn't just about Ethan or Jason, it was about the entire room, about everyone who had ever dismissed someone's truth based on appearance. Mrs. Parker stood there, her head bowed, her lips trembling with what could only be described as shame. She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't look at Jason. She just stood there, frozen, caught in the gravity of the situation. For a long time, no one moved. Not even Colin, who had been the first to mock Ethan, sat in stunned silence. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. His friends, too, seemed paralyzed, their eyes wide, their faces pale. It wasn't just the shock of seeing Jason Statham in the classroom. It was the crushing realization that they had all been complicit in something far deeper than a simple joke. They had all judged Ethan, based on the color of his skin, on their preconceived ideas of who he was supposed to be. And now, with Jason's presence in the room, the illusion had been shattered. Jason turned his attention back to Ethan, his voice softening. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his words filled with affection and warmth. "You've got more strength in you than I ever did at your age. Don't let anyone take that away from you." Ethan's throat tightened, his eyes welling with tears. It wasn't because he was sad. It was because for the first time in a long while he felt like he belonged. His father had just spoken a truth so powerful, so undeniable, that it had shifted the energy in the room. As the class remained silent, Jason glanced around once more, his eyes stopping on Mrs. Parker. The teacher still hadn't spoken. She hadn't even lifted her head. Jason let out a slow, controlled breath, his gaze unwavering. "You judged him," he said simply, his voice low but resonant. "You didn't believe him because of the way he looked, but you should have known better. Truth doesn't need to match anyone's expectations. It stands on its own, and it deserves to be heard." Mrs. Parker swallowed hard, her fingers twitching at the edge of her desk. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the moment was too much for her to brush aside, and she knew it. There were no excuses, no way to deflect or downplay the damage that had been done. She had dismissed a child who had dared to speak his truth, and she had done so based on assumptions that were never hers to make. Ethan watched her, the woman who had mocked him, who had laughed at him in front of the class. But now, all he felt was a quiet satisfaction. He had faced down their mockery, their prejudice, and he had stood tall. He had spoken his truth, and now it was undeniable. Jason gave Ethan one last look, a proud smile crossing his face. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he paused and looked back at the class. "Remember this moment," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "You're all capable of believing in something you don't understand, but you have to open your minds, open your hearts. Don't be afraid to listen." With that, Jason walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. Ethan sat at his desk, the picture of his father still resting beside him. He could feel the shift in the air, the slow ripple of change. The students who had once laughed at him now looked at him differently. Some of them seemed unsure, still processing what had just happened. But for the first time since arriving at this school, Ethan didn't feel like he was invisible. He wasn't just the kid they mocked. He was Ethan Walker, the son of Jason Statham, and more importantly, a person whose truth mattered. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, no one rushed out the door. The students sat still for a moment, their minds reeling. Colin, who had once mocked him, was the first to leave. His head down, his footsteps hurried. The others followed in a quiet procession, but there was no laughter now, no cruel words. Ethan remained seated, his hands still clutching the photo of his father. He hadn't expected things to change overnight. But something had changed, something profound. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had made everyone else see him, not just as a joke, but as someone whose truth deserved to be heard. And for the first time, that was enough. Later that evening, after the school day had ended, Ethan found himself sitting at the kitchen table once again, the same photo of his father in front of him. His mom sat across from him, watching him quietly. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes bright with a new sense of purpose. "I didn't lie, Mom," he said softly. "I didn't make it up. It's the truth." Rebecca smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "I know, baby, I know." Ethan leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't invisible anymore. And he didn't need anyone else's approval to be who he was. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story. Ethan's journey of standing up for his truth, despite the laughter and ridicule, is one that resonates deeply with so many of us. Have you ever faced a situation where your truth was dismissed or mocked by others? How did you handle it? We believe that stories like Ethan's can spark important conversations about prejudice, identity, and the importance of believing in yourself. In the comments, share your own experiences or your thoughts on the story. What stood out to you the most? What message did you take away from Ethan's courage? Let's discuss how we can all work together to create more understanding, respect, and empathy in the world around us. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give us a like and hit that subscribe button for more powerful content that challenges societal norms and uplifts voices that need to be heard. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're here to bring stories that matter to light, and we're excited to continue this journey with all of you. Let's keep the conversation going.